we have the government statistician, Professor Samuel Enim, to explain to us what's going on with inflation and how we should interpret the numbers. Prof, thanks so much for joining us. Good morning.
Good morning, Bernard, and thank you for the platform.
So you released the latest CPI figures, and I think for us in the media, the two takeaways was the reduction in year-on-year inflation from around 25 to 23. But also from a news perspective, the monthly inflation had reached a 10-month high. But it appears all of us in the media focus more on the reduction in the year-on-year than in the fact that the inflation for the month of 3.2 was the highest since July. Is it our fault, or is it the way you did the press conference? And is it even important for us to be discussing the two numbers?
That's an interesting question, whether it's the fault of the media or it's mine. But whatever it is, I'm happy there's another opportunity for us to discuss it further. And we always emphasize the need to look at the disaggregate, and also based on the disaggregate to try and get a sense of the drivers of inflation. So if you don't mind, I can throw about 5 minutes highlight on that.
Yes.
Yes. So from the perspective of the aggregate, you are right, year-on-year inflation went down by 1.9 percentage points, precisely from 25.0 to 23.1. And month-on-month inflation went up by 1.4 percentage points, and as you rightly said, putting it at 3.2, which is the high. Keep in mind that in April we're at 1.8. Then what makes the conversation important is from both perspectives we have to think through the drivers. The year-on-year inflation, as we've always talked about, is calculated on what is happening currently vis-a-vis what happened same time May 2023. The influence on May 2023 is always significant because it is the current year's CPI minus the previous year's CPI, in this case 2023 May CPI, divided by May 2023 CPI. So the previous year's CPI goes into the numerator and the denominator as well. What happened last year was that between April and May 2023, we saw the highest change in CPI, which was 8.1 points. In April 2023, we had a CPI of 170.6, and then in May 2023, it was 178.7, culminating in the 8.1 points that I talked about. This is what is going to go into your denominator, and once this is huge, it would bring down the rate of inflation. On the side of month-on-month inflation, which has gone up by 1.4 percentage points, as I indicated, if you look at the 13 divisions that we use in the computation of CPI and rate of inflation, only two of the divisions had rate of inflation higher than the overall national rate of inflation of 3.2. And significance of it was transport, which saw a month-on-month rate of inflation of 10.6%. This is what we want all of us to avert our minds to, because transport influences most of the other items in the CPI basket. So if on a month-on-month basis, we are seeing a 10.6 monthly inflation for transport, then going forward, one should be concerned in terms of the potential transmission mechanism that would run through transport to the other items that we have in the basket.
Which is why the weight you will give transport will be strong, because it affects others. So that's a very important point. Now, the other points, when you say base effect, that's what you explained for the year-on-year. So which of the two numbers is more important for decision-making then? Because I recognize that globally, when inflation is referred to, is the year-on-year that usually people announce. But it appears to me that the month-on-month is a more accurate reflection of people's reality, because like this week we've been discussing food prices, and tomato prices have increased quite significantly. And when I look at your month-on-month inflation for the subclasses of food, correctly, vegetables, tubers, plantain, cooking, bananas and pulses have the highest. So can we say that maybe year on year is good for certain kinds of analysis and then monthly is good for other kinds? Just let's talk a bit about the usefulness of the two.
Bernard, again, thank you very much, because I always take advantage of this and distinguish between what I call statistical output and statistical input. And what that simply means is that the year-on-year inflation is for reporting purposes relative to what happened last year. It doesn't really help with decision making. It tells you where you have gotten to at any point in time. But if you really want to tweak policies and understand what is happening currently, it's the month-on-month inflation that you need to keep an eye on, and at any point in time ensure that it's steadily going down. Unfortunately, our month-on-month inflation historically has been very volatile, which simply means that in current terms, whatever policies that we are putting in, we are not able to sustain it, so that for, let's say, a 6-month consecutive period, a 12-month consecutive period, we can say that steadily we are bringing down our month-on-month inflation. So the question is not which one is important, but it depends on what you want to use the statistics for. If you just want to go out there and say that I'm doing well, you go ahead and use your year-on-year. But if you really want to tweak policy and understand what is happening in terms of the outcomes of policies, then it's your month-on-month inflation that you need to look at. Because as you rightly said, it tells you what happens now and the previous month, what happens now and the 2 previous months. So in real time, you are able to understand which policies are influencing what. But within the year, it's a basket of different things, different policies, different shocks, different behavioral issues, and it's difficult to really say that this is what is influencing the year-on-year inflation.
That's very interesting, because when the Bank of Ghana MPC announced their policy rate, in fact, their inflation target, the so-called plus or minus 8, is usually year-on-year. But from the explanation you've given and from looking carefully at the numbers, it may make sense to revisit the assumptions behind using year-on-year for inflation targeting, because if your policy rate is supposed to point to expectations, it will appear to me as though the monthly inflation may be more useful. I don't know if that conversation has been had at all, and whether the Statistical Service and the Bank of Ghana have deliberations around the usefulness of the two measures for the inflation targeting framework. Because for a long time, the interest rates have been set higher than inflation, and some people think it actually just worsens the situation. So maybe we should be having a discussion with your friends at the BOG too about which of the numbers to use in their inflation targeting. Don't you think so?
I mean, I'm not going to delve into the details of it. Again, let me give some highlights around this conversation. We should have a platform to really talk about this issue of inflation targeting. It is not within my space as government statistician to do that, but from an economist point of view, I would say that that conversation should be held, and wherever we have the inflation targeting can come up at another time. The second broad comment is that using monthly inflation, as I indicated, because it's so volatile for us as a country and a number of developing countries, we move away from the month-on-month just because of the volatility. But you are absolutely right. If we really want to address it and see its impact, we cannot say that we are not looking at the month-on-month inflation. So at the minimum, what my proposal is that if we really want to do inflation targeting, and as I said, it's a conversation that we need to have at another point, we need to look at both month-on-month inflation and year-on-year inflation. And I keep saying this, that we don't have to look at things only from a monetary policy perspective. From the real sector perspective, now that we are talking about transport, now that we are talking about food inflation, we also need to look at our targeting from the real sector as well. It is about time we complement real sector interventions with monetary policy interventions if we want to drive down inflation.
Finally, you explained the transportation effect on monthly inflation, and that was a good explanation we accept. Two surprises for me: that non-food generally is higher than food inflation, because I tend to hear more complaints about food on air than about non-food. And number two, I also noticed that inflation for locally produced items is higher than for imported items, which also is a surprise for me, because this has also been a period of high depreciation. And I'm suspecting that imported items would obviously, because of the currency depreciation, be more expensive. So could it be that because this imported versus local is year on year, we have to go back to the base effect in that as well? Because I was thinking that imported inflation would be higher than locally produced. So that was a surprise for me. And also I was thinking that food inflation would be higher than non-food. But maybe my assumptions were wrong. Any comment?
I mean, if you look at the trends, you are right. Traditionally, we've had food inflation being higher than non-food inflation. But again, let's look at this from the two perspectives that we started the conversation with earlier on. On a month-on-month basis, we saw a 0.9 percentage point difference between food and non-food inflation, with food inflation 2.7, non-food inflation 3.6. Keeping in mind that transport, which had the highest month-on-month inflation of 10.6%, is a component of non-food inflation. So clearly the driver for the non-food inflation month-on-month 3.6 was as a result of transport. The other component that had a month-on-month inflation higher than the overall month-on-month inflation of 3.2 was education services, which is also non-food inflation with 5.5 month-on-month inflation. Consistently in the last 6 months, we have seen a steady decline in the share of food inflation to overall inflation. We've hovered around 52.6% towards the end of 2023, and now we are doing 41.5% as a share of food to overall food inflation. It's a basket of arguments that might come in at this point in time. One, for the fact that the non-food side is increasing, and two, for the fact that around this time of the year, we gradually see a decline in food inflation. I'm happy in your earlier submission, you moved from that aggregate food and touched on things like tomatoes and yam. You touched on tomatoes. So that story, we know we had production challenges with it. But a commodity like yam in the past 20 months keeps moving in and out of the list of top 20 items that record the highest price change. And this time round, it found its way in there with a weight of 1.6 indices and recording a price change of 37.4. It moved out of the top 20 to the 53rd position in April, and now has come back to the 18th position with a price change of 37.4 and a weight of 1.6. So it is always in the disaggregate that you better understand what is happening. So if we want to talk about food coming down, we lose sight of the fact that some important items within the food component are seeing increases over the period of time. In terms of locally produced items and imported items, as I said earlier on, we saw a 5.1 percentage point difference. And this is because locally produced items had an inflation of 24.7 and imported items 19.6. This is consistent with what we've been seeing in the past. Anytime we are presenting this, we say to the public that we need to be careful because there are some commodities that their inputs are imported, which would end up as locally produced because it goes through further processing and then we capture it as a locally produced item. So this is one of the classifications that mutual exclusiveness does not occur because of the way I've explained it. So one would always have to be careful saying that this particular thing is being driven by, imported inflation is being driven by this particular variable because of that. Especially when you don't look at the items within within locally produced items and the items within imported items. To really say a case that this is purely imported and this is purely locally produced.
That's fair enough, because obviously even some locally produced items have foreign components. So yes, it's a very nuanced discussion, but we appreciate it. And I also want to point out that, I don't know if this is the first time, but when you finish the presentation, there's an addendum which has the base effect explanation. And I thought that, do you always do that, or you needed to add this because you wanted to avoid misunderstanding of the figures?
We don't do that. And as you rightly said, we do it occasionally so that when people ask the question, what is the base effect, they have some historical understanding based on these technical sessions. The reason why we don't do that is, and even yesterday, we did this after the press release because we didn't want people to go out and give different numbers for inflation on scenarios that are not the reality. It's just for explanatory purposes, and that is why we don't add it to it.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for your work. That's Professor Samuel Enim, Government Statistician. Always a pleasure talking to him.